Chapter 9. A Mysterious Visitor. Lincoln was inaugurated president on March 4th, and the whole country seemed to hold its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. At home, things were actually better. In the weeks after their first visit, Joseph and his two friends thoroughly explored the cave. The first room they kept to store lanterns, ropes, and such, but they transformed the larger cavern into a comfortable room. A combination of crates and barrels was turned into a table and chairs, and a ring of rocks made a place for a small fire. They even had enough blankets and rugs to make a comfortable bed. The boys met there nearly every day, and a fast friendship had grown among them. Joseph was teaching his friends how to whittle, although Zachary's first efforts were so misshapen they all had to laugh. I can see it in my mind, but my fingers won't do what I want, Zachary complained. David's attempts were better, but still not as good as Joseph's. Both boys enjoyed their new hobby, however, and many a pleasant afternoon was passed whittling and talking around a small fire in the pit. Mr. Byers wore a worried frown most of the time. In addition to the business he had lost because of his outspoken objection to slavery, people were too concerned with the possibility of war to build or repair houses. Clay had passed his Latin exam and was now living in Dr. Mercer's house, studying medicine. He came home to visit on the weekends, but only for a few hours. When he was home, he complained about Dr. Mercer. He read a paper that said sickness might be caused by tiny creatures too small to see. Dr. Mercer thinks that if we use soap and water, we can wash these strange creatures away. He makes me scrub the examining room with a strong soap after every patient. I wanted to study medicine, not be a washerwoman, Clay said. Dr. Mercer is a fine physician, Mr. Byers answered. When cholera broke out a few years ago, hardly anyone in Branson Mills died. Other towns were not so fortunate. Jared had been confined to bed nearly every day since the celebration. Do you think that's what's wrong with Jared? Joseph asked his stepfather one evening. Does he have these tiny creatures in him? Mr. Byers shook his head no. He was just born with a weak heart. Well, what will happen to him? Will it get better? Joseph asked. I don't know, Mr. Byers admitted. His face was sad. Joseph knew that Mr. Byers cared very much what happened to Jared. Even on the nights he returned home, tired and covered in wood dust, he still found time to visit Jared and read him a story. Mr. Byers hesitated. I've been meaning to speak to you about your friend Zachary. Joseph bristled. What about him? His father has an unsavory reputation about town. I'm not sure that it's wise to spend so much time with him. No one but David and him will talk to me because of you, Joseph said bitterly. I like Zachary. He isn't like his father. If it weren't for him, I wouldn't even be alive. Mr. Byers looked pained. I didn't intend that you should suffer because of my views. I do, Joseph said steadily. So does Mama. Most of the ladies at church won't even talk to her. But for me, at least, it's been all right. If the other boys had been friendly, I probably wouldn't be friends with Zachary, or David either, he added, realizing for the first time that it was true. I didn't know things were so difficult for you. I shall trust your judgment about your friends, Mr. Byers told him. He hesitated. Perhaps someday you may even count me among them. Joseph was so surprised by this remark that he couldn't answer. After a minute, Mr. Byers turned back to his accounts. The weather turned bitter cold, and Joseph's breath froze in little puffs when he milked Daisy. One cold, dark morning, as he was milking, he heard a strange thump from the loft where the hay was stored. He paused, nervously scanning the dark corners of the carriage house barn. Then he heard a soft scrabbling sound. Heart pounding, Joseph jumped to his feet. Is anyone there? He called, wishing his voice didn't quaver so much. Meow, came the answer. Old Tom, a stray cat that lived in the barn and kept it free from mice, leaped down from the loft and rubbed against Joseph's leg. You scared me, Joseph said, sending a squirt of milk toward the cat. Old Tom caught it and drank. Then he licked his whiskers, purring his appreciation. Daisy didn't have much milk, Joseph announced when he brought in the bucket. Last night's milking was down, too, his mother remarked. Joseph nodded. Now that Clay was gone, he had to do morning and afternoon milking by himself. She'll probably be all right in a few days, he said. Joseph had better things to do than worry about Daisy. Zachary had discovered another tunnel in the cave, and today they were planning to explore it. Go then, his mother said with a smile, seeing his impatience. I can't imagine what you boys find to explore. Joseph tried not to look guilty. He had never told his mother about the cave. He put on a heavy coat and raced to the river. Outside there was a light dusting of snow, and people walked hunched over, faces tucked into their coats as protection against the icy winds. Inside the cave, however, it was warmer. Joseph lit the candle in the lantern and put it on a ledge. What's this? David said. He picked up a piece of paper that had been tucked underneath the lantern and read it out loud. I like your cave. It's very nice. I came before, so this makes twice. Zachary groaned. Someone else knows about the cave. That'll spoil everything. Who did thou think it might be? David asked thoughtfully. Joseph scratched his head. I hope it's not Andrew or any of his friends. David looked at the paper. The writing is too neat to be his. I've seen Andrew's writing. He waved his arm. Perhaps I should not speak so unkindly, but I doubt that Andrew is clever enough to make a rhyme. They went through the list of boys they knew, but in the end they were just as puzzled as when they found the note. The boys spent the afternoon exploring the new tunnel leading from the underground room. Unfortunately, this one proved to be a dead end. They piled their lanterns and ropes in the first cave room, and Zachary led the way out. We'd better leave a note warning whoever it is about the crevice in the first tunnel, Joseph said. We don't have any paper or pencil, David pointed out. Zachary tore off a strip of his shirt, and they fastened it with rocks across the tunnel. Do you think they'll understand? Joseph asked. He looked down in the crevice and shuddered, thinking of the terrible drop. Zachary nodded. It should make them stop long enough to see it. They headed back to the opening, David in the lead. Suddenly he pulled back and flattened himself against the entrance. He pressed his finger on his lips, warning Joseph and Zachary to be quiet. From outside the cave came the sound of men's voices. Joseph stayed in the shadows, listening. It's those two slave catchers, Bales and Scroggins, he whispered. What are they doing in town again? David whispered back. I thought they caught the runaway slave they were after. The two men were walking along the bank, obviously believing they were alone. Hidden behind the pile of brush at the cave entrance, the boys could hear every word clearly. We'll search every house and barn in town, Scroggins was saying. That'll take forever, Bales whined. Not if we get that sheriff to get some deputies and help us. Well, why would he do that? Bales asked. He doesn't like us much. The law's the law, and he's sworn to uphold it. He'll feel bound to do it. Bales cackled. We'll let the sheriff do all the work, and then, when they flush them out, we'll be there to grab them. Scroggins snapped his fingers. If that doesn't work, we'll bring in some good tracking dogs. Ha ha! What we're going to do with that $500 Mr. March promised us? Bales asked as the two men moved out of hearing distance, heading back for the main part of town. Scroggins laughed. Joseph could not hear the answer, but the wicked laugh lingered in Joseph's ears as the men disappeared from sight. The boy scrambled out of the cave. What if they were the ones who discovered the tunnel? Joseph asked. I don't think they would just leave a polite note and not steal anything, David answered, pointing to the ropes, lanterns, and candles. There must be some more escaped slaves around here somewhere, Joseph said. Do thou think we should tell the sheriff what we heard? David asked as they walked home. Zachary shrugged. I think we ought to try to find the slaves before those men. Did you hear him? There's a $500 reward. David looked shocked. Would thou turn them in? Zachary nodded. It's the law. We'd get $500 for obeying the law. I would help them escape, David said stoutly. Then you would be a fool, and you could go to jail, Zachary said. The two boys glared at each other. What would you do? Zachary asked Joseph. The question had been whirling about in his mind. I don't know, he said finally. The day that had been so exciting a few minutes before suddenly seemed less bright, and they walked the rest of the way in silence. You seem upset, Joseph, said Mrs. Byers when he arrived home. Is something troubling you? Quickly, he told her of the conversation he'd overheard. It is not our affair, Joseph. The law says the slaves must be returned. Even in his inaugural speech, President Lincoln promised to uphold the fugitive slave law. Well, what if the law is wrong? Joseph asked. Everyone believes that Mr. Lincoln will try to change the law. Until then, I believe we have to obey it. Joseph knew his mother was right, but he was still troubled. That the law could be used by people like Scroggins and Bales didn't seem right. Jared was sitting near the stove playing with a small carved coach Joseph had made for him. Are the horses done? He asked wistfully. Shamed, Joseph thought about how long he had been promising to finish them. I'll carve them right now, he answered. He spread a cloth on the floor to catch any shavings and fetched the wood from his room. He had already whittled out the rough shapes. He was using a piece of weathered wood he'd found by the river. Jared crowded close to watch. They're going to be beautiful, he said, touching the smooth gray wood. Mr. Byers arrived home earlier than usual. No business today, he told Mrs. Byers with a worried look. He took a moment to admire the carvings. Have you done the evening milking? He asked Joseph. No, sir, Joseph said, jumping up guiltily. Before he could reach for his coat, however, there was a loud, demanding knock at the front door. Mr. Byers opened it, and Bales and Scroggins pushed their way in, bringing a blast of icy wind with them. Jared leaned close to Joseph. Scroggins had a red nose from the cold, and his hair had blown wildly in the wind so that it stuck out in strange directions. Flakes of snow glistened on his hair and scraggly beard. Bales was the quieter of the two, kind of person you would never notice in a crowd. My name's Robert Scroggins, Scroggins said. This is my friend Cyrus Bales. His soft spoken voice was in contrast with his wild appearance. We talked before. I remember, Mr. Byers said coldly. Scroggins smiled. We know who you are, too. Everyone in town has told us you are the man to see. Noticing Mrs. Byers, Scroggins nodded politely. Evening, Mrs. Byers. I was just about to ask your husband here what he knows about two escaped slaves. I know nothing about your escaped slaves, Mr. Byers said. But if I did, I wouldn't tell the likes of you. I don't suppose you'd mind if we looked around, Scroggins said. I would, Mr. Byers replied. As a matter of fact, I must ask you to leave. You're upsetting my family. I give you my word that there are no escaped slaves here. For an instant, Scroggins seemed to consider pushing his way past Mr. Byers. But something, possibly Mr. Byers' hard look, made him think better of it. We'll be back in the morning, he said, and this time we'll bring the sheriff. Then, in another blast of cold air, they were gone. Mrs. Byers sat down weakly in a chair. What awful men! She looked at her husband in alarm. There isn't any truth to what they say, is there? You're not hiding escaped slaves. Mr. Byers shook his head. No, I haven't seen them. Joseph slipped into his coat and took the bucket for the milking. It was cold, and he walked briskly to the carriage house. Daisy was inside waiting patiently. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw movement, a whirl of calico skirts climbing the ladder to the loft. Hey! He shouted. A girl froze on the top step of the ladder. Slowly she turned, and Joseph saw that she was holding an old broken cup. It took him a second to realize the cup was full of milk. Daisy's milk. So that's why Daisy hasn't been giving enough milk, he said. You've been stealing it. I'm sorry, the girl stammered. Her dark eyes were wide with fear. We were just so hungry. We? Joseph repeated stupidly. Then a second face appeared at the top of the stairs, and Joseph remembered where he'd seen them. You're the girls who were sold a couple weeks ago, he said. Suddenly, the whole truth dawned on him. You're the escaped slaves? He asked incredulously. Please, the first girl begged. Our master bought us together, but then he sold my sister to his brother. They were going to take her away. Why did you come here? Joseph asked. I heard what Mr. Byers said that day, so when we escaped, I pretended that I had a message for him. We asked people for directions to his house. So, Mr. Byers knows you're here? The girl, Lily, Joseph remembered, shook her head. After we came, I was afraid. I wasn't sure he would help us. Joseph stared at them. When Zachary had asked him what he would do this afternoon, he never dreamed that he would find out so soon. The girls clung to each other, Lily looking defiant, Miriam afraid, waiting to see what he would do.